Hello everyone, and welcome to the Seilevel webinar entitled Business Requirements Techniques for Delivering Value While Controlling Scope. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Simon Mulverhill, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. We do have a couple of quick housekeeping items to cover before we get started, so I'm going to review that really quickly and then pass things over to Joy and James. First of all, if you need to adjust your audio from your computer, you can simply click on the audio broadcast button. Or if you'd like to call in on the telephone, you can use the number listed in the event invite. I also want to let you know that we will be giving away a copy of each of our books to a couple lucky attendees at the conclusion of today's presentation. Also, at the very top of the WebEx program, you'll see a navigation bar with access to the Q&A window. We're going to be using that to take questions to answer at the end of today's presentation. Just make sure that you send to all panelists. Okay, I want to give you a few seconds to get your bearings, and then we'll start recording the session at this point as well. And also, we will be emailing out a link to the recording after today's session has concluded. Okay, so let me introduce today's presenters. Joy Beatty has been in the business analysis field for over 10 years and has received both her CBAP certification and the new PMI PBA certification. She's Vice President of Research and Development at Seilevel and is responsible for implementing concepts for requirements best practices, including the methodology Seilevel employees execute on projects, and our business analysis training course material. She's a founding member of her local IIBA chapter and is currently on the core writing team, writing version 3 of IIBA's Business Analyst Body of Knowledge, or BAVOC, as well as joint authoring PMI's Best Practices for Business Analyst's Guide. She has also co-authored 2 books, one of which was a joint effort with Carl Wiegers, and we'll provide a few more details on them towards the end of the webinar. James Hulgan is a business architect at Seilevel and works to ensure that clients' software projects deliver the most return on investment. As all segments lead, he is also responsible for resourcing and staffing projects for the Seilevel team. James is a certified Seilevel instructor and has trained and mentored many business analysts and product managers on how to define requirements and manage project scope. He's also presented for several IIBA chapter meetings and BA professional development conferences across the United States. And with that, I'll pass it along to Joy to walk us through what we'll be covering in the presentation.
All right, thanks, Simon. Welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you here. And definitely feel free to send your questions as they come up. Simon will help monitor those, and at the end we'll try and save some time to go through them. So first of all, you're looking at the topics we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to define what are business requirements. I think this is important because everybody has their own definition. Then we're going to talk through 4 different scoping models that are based on those business requirements. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with how do you take all of that information and use it to control the scope on your projects. And I should also mention all of the content from today, for the most part, is going to come out of the book that we did with Carl Wiegers, Software Requirements, and it's going to be in Chapter 5. If you have that book and want to reference it later, Chapter 5 is going to be the key for you. All right, let's set the stage for talking about business requirements. So there's a relatively famous study out there that was done by the Standish Group. It's called the Chaos Report, and I'm sure many of you have probably heard about it. If you haven't, you may hear about it in the future. It's frequently referenced when we talk about requirements things. And the reason for that, so this study looked at why are IT projects failing? And the main reasons that IT projects fail are shown here on the screen. First of all, we've got things like unclear objectives. The requirements are changing over the course of the project. We have incomplete requirements, and then this is a big one, lack of user input on the requirements. And I'm sure many of you have heard the common story where the manager says, you don't need to talk to my users. I know what they need, right? Well, that doesn't always work. But these things here on the screen tell us that there's something very wrong with that relationship between the business stakeholders and IT. And I think that the business requirements are at the heart of defining what our business stakeholders really need. So if we get those right, we have a much better chance at successfully implementing projects in IT. Now, business requirements are important specifically around these 4 causes here because they help us define our objectives so that they're very clear. They help us manage any change in our requirements. They help us identify requirements that might be incomplete. And they tell us where we need user input. So I really feel like they are the crux of a successful or failed project. and they're going to help address these issues head on. So, as I said a minute ago, business requirements, what are they? As I go from organization to organization, I find that they all define business requirements a little bit differently, so I at least want to set some framework for what we're talking about today when we use that phrase. I think of them as a set of information that in aggregate is going to describe a need that leads to one or more projects that deliver a solution that ultimately deliver some desired business outcomes. So essentially, these are the things that tell us why the organization is implementing the system and the business benefits that the organization hopes to achieve out of that particular system. So very, very simple. But let me put the business requirements in a hierarchy here in relation to other types of requirements. And I think that, these are slightly different terms. You'll see organization, organization, but I think you'll recognize the different levels within your own organization, even if you use different names on them, right? So at the top level, we have business requirements. These are, again, why the organization is implementing the system. Below that, we have our user requirements, and below that, we have our function requirements. The user requirements are going to describe the user's goals for a product, and the functional requirements at the bottom of the hierarchy, those are the things that tell us about the behaviors the system's going to exhibit. That's the stuff that developers and testers are going to implement and test. That bottom level, that function requirement is key for that. But notice there is a hierarchy here with links between them, and the implication is that every functional requirement would trace back to a user requirement, which then trace back to a business requirement at the top. And I'm kind of ignoring in this particular diagram the fact there are things like non-functional requirements and quality attributes. Just for simplicity, I'm focusing on kind of the main path through that hierarchy there. So again, business requirements are why, user requirements are what the users are going to be able to do, and functional requirements are what the developer implements. I love that I have worked on projects where you produce a requirements document, but when you what's inside that document, it's all three of these levels in one. That happens in I think a lot of places, and that's why it's important to at least acknowledge there are different levels, even if your organization is saying those are all business requirements. We really think of them differently. One more quick point I want to make on this is that the IIBA has slightly different names for these things, but they're similar. They use business requirements as well. They use stakeholder requirements instead of user requirements, and that's particularly addressing the fact that not all projects that business analysts work on are IT projects with users. And so they've kind of tried to broaden that category a little bit and called it stakeholder requirements. And then that bottom level, they actually call that solution requirements. And this is really important, again, if you're working on a process implementation project where you don't have any kind of software or system implementation per se, there is no such thing as a function requirement. That terminology doesn't really exist in that world, so that's why we've called them solution requirements on that bottom level for IIBA. Again, you can use any of these terminology. And I want to give you a couple examples of each of those. All of the examples that we're going to go through today are out of a chemical tracking system that we've kind of simplified. It's a real project, but we've simplified some examples here for demonstration purposes. At the top level, we have a clear objective that tells us why are we building the system. And in this case, it's reduce chemical purchasing expenses by 25% in the first year. Below that, we have a user requirement. So one example of a user requirement is, as a chemist, I want to request a chemical so that I can perform experiments. And that user requirement level, you could write those as user stories, or you might write them as use cases, for example. This one here is written much more like a user story. Even if you're not in an Agile project, you can use that format. And then the bottom level is the functional requirement. This one is just a simple statement about what the system must do to support that user requirement. And in our example, it's the portal shall use a shopping cart to contain chemicals the user selects to order. And keep in mind, there would be a lot of different functional requirements to support that particular user requirement. That's just one example. So again, business requirements are an aggregation of a few types of information. And these are the 4 types of information. We're going to go through each one of these one at a time, but we have business opportunities, business objectives, success metrics, vision statements. So let's look at each one in a little bit more detail. All right, the first type of business requirement is the business opportunity. In corporate IT systems, this is usually going to be the business problem that is being solved. It might be the process that is being improved. When we look at things like commercial products, it could be something more like the business opportunity that exists out there, or maybe the market in which the product will be competing. Like we look externally to say, oh, wow, there's a space that we could do something different. That's a business opportunity. So it could take any of those forms. To discover these, we would ask questions like, what's keeping the organization from reaching its goals, or what are the opportunities in the marketplace? That's going to help us uncover opportunities during elicitation sessions. So an example from our chemical tracking system, the business problem could be something like, well, managing chemical inventories manually costs too much and is inefficient. It's a very simple problem that leads us to a particular project. All right, the second type of information in a business requirement would be a business objective, and this is the benefit that an organization expects to receive from the project. These need to be written in a quantitative and measurable way. That helps us know that we can actually measure it later to see if the objective was met and therefore the project was successful. Now, I'm going to make a statement that is sometimes controversial. Certainly you're welcome to bring up questions on that later, but business objectives are almost always going to relate back to money. In the business context, this is going to be something like a revenue goal or a profit goal or a cost-cutting goal. So I understand that sometimes we have to use proxies for money. It could be the number of new customers in a system, or it could be the number of units sold. But ultimately, those things map back to money in the end, and that's just kind of the reality of why we undertake any kind of IT projects. And even regulatory or compliance projects relate to money because we're doing those projects to either avoid fines or to stay in business or potentially to keep someone out of jail, which would be quite costly. You know, I worked on a project, it was 12 years ago, and it was an IT project that was meant to combine 7 different systems into one. And I will tell you that, you know, like that's what IT believed the business objective was let's combine these systems into one. At the end of the day, that's not a business objective. It may be a solution to a very real business problem, but at the end of the day, the business never cares that there's 1 system or 2 systems or 7 systems. That's just not important to them. There's no dollar benefit associated with that the way it's stated. So instead, if we really think we need to combine these systems, we would need to look at, well, why are we doing it? And maybe it's around cost, and we would put some dollar value to that cost, right, to help the business understand what they would get out of having 1 instead of 7 systems. In our particular chemical tracking example, you know, one objective here might be to reduce that chemical purchasing expense from, let's say, $1 million down to $750,000 in the first year. All right, so today they're spending $1 million. We're going to take on this project and hopefully cut that, you can see, by $250,000 over the course of 1 year. And if you don't know what the dollar amounts are to put in your objective statements, you know, you could think in this particular case it could be about how do we reduce the number of wasted chemicals, and we'd have a number associated with that, or the number of hours spent on managing chemicals, right? So we'd look at the employee's time. So there's different ways, again, that we can find some proxies for money in this particular case. But the key is no matter what you use, you need to have some kind of measurable metric associated with these objectives. Now, organizations generally are going to undertake some kind of a project so they can either solve a problem or exploit an opportunity. So the objectives relate back to the opportunities. That's the really big point here, is that these things are related. So when we look at it closer, we're going to say, well, what's keeping us from achieving our particular objectives? When we do that, we will find more problems. Or if we have a problem, we might ask, what would it look like if I solved that problem? And that's an indication that we have found an objective. And the point of this slide is to show you that it's a very iterative process. You're going to find an objective and you're probably going to discover another problem, right? And then maybe you find a lower level problem and you ask, well, why am I not solving that today? What's wrong? You'll find even a more detailed problem, and you can keep going through this process. You actually end up with something a bit like a hierarchy of problems and objectives when you take this process all the way through. So at the bottom, you'll see a couple examples of kinds of questions you could ask. So things, again, like, you know, I have an objective, what's keeping us from achieving this goal? The other thing you can ask is, why is that an important goal? Right? If somebody's telling you they need to increase customer satisfaction by a certain %, you can ask, why? why do we care about increasing customer satisfaction? And the answer you get is probably going to be something like to increase the number of customers. And you ask, why do we care about that? And then they tell you, well, because we need to sell more. I'm just making up an example on the fly, but you kind of get the feel, I hope, that it's an iterative process and we can keep asking why to understand really why we're doing the project. What are the problems we're solving and what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve? Okay, so I'd like to hand it over and let James talk for a little bit about success metrics.
All right, thank you, Joy. So Joy spoke a little bit about business objectives, and often business objectives are defined that really cannot be measured until after the project is complete, and in some cases, several years after the project is complete. So, in our example, we want to decrease costs by $250,000 in the next year, but we obviously can't really measure that until a year from the point when we're done with the project. So, how do you know that the project is on track to deliver the business objectives? And, the success metrics are really the mechanism for doing that. And this is why we like to define interim success metrics, just to make sure that you're able to tell and measure along the way that you're on track to meet the objectives. So success metrics are really something that can be tracked as the project progresses, and then during testing or shortly after a release to see if you're close to the business objective and determine whether you need to change direction. So the timeline that you're seeing on the slide demonstrates that when we start a project, then we have a few interim metrics that we track, then we launch it, do a few more measurements to see if we're still on track, and then possibly adjust, and eventually reaching a point where we can measure whether the business objective was met. So to illustrate this, an example for our system is to reduce time spent ordering chemicals to 10 minutes on 80% of orders. If we can measure this immediately after we release, we can be hopeful that our overall business objective to reduce costs by $250,000 will be met, even though we can't measure the business objective for a year. All right, and so, another thing that's important and that Joy, started to allude to are vision statements. These describe the product that will ultimately achieve the business objectives. They paint a picture of where we're all hoping to go on the project, and, I like to think about, if it's a vision statement because we're all looking in the direction that we want to go. And it helps align the priorities and activities of the project stakeholders toward that common objective. They usually include a concise summary of the long-term purpose and the intent of the product. They might be somewhat idealistic. I mean, a lot of people think of vision statements as somewhat, touchy-feely, but they're also, need to be grounded in the realities of existing or anticipated markets, whatever the enterprise architecture is that's coming up, whatever the strategic direction of the organization is, as well as consider resource limitations. So you might encourage key stakeholders to draft their own vision statements, and this will help illustrate the different understandings about their objectives. And even if you're well into your project, it's never too late to do this exercise. I mean, we come into projects all the time where not only is there not, business objectives or success metrics, but there's no real, clear vision for the project. And, helping them draft a vision statement is a good first step to getting us towards, pointing in the same direction in terms of objectives. So, this helps you fix that lack of focus and clarify the direction as soon as you possibly can. All right, so on the slide, we're looking at, general format for a vision statement. And, I struggled a long time with kind of understanding how to write vision statements. I didn't consider myself very good at it until I really looked at something that was a little bit more formulaic to help put together. And this formula kind of helped me a little bit formulate vision statements for my projects. So, in general, and we'll look at an example in a moment, but in general, the key components are, who is the product targeted for? What is their need or their opportunity? What's the actual product called? What type of product is it? What are its major capabilities, key benefits, or reason to buy? How does it differentiate from other solutions? And a concise statement about the value of this product. So you might not complete all of these, but you should at least try. And one other thing I want to mention is that, we use the term product a lot, and this can refer to both internal or external facing products. So, think of any sort of internal IT project that you're delivering, either to a business stakeholder or to other IT stakeholders as a product. And all the concepts that we're discussing really apply to both, products that can face externally as well as internally.
One of the things, James, I'll just jump in and say that oftentimes we like to think of business analysis as doing product management, to really add on to what you're saying. So whether you call yourself a business analyst, systems analyst, doesn't matter. you might think of yourself as a product manager, even on an internal IT system. That can actually change your mindset a little, I think, help you to naturally do some behaviors that are good for your project.
Right, and that's a really good point, because a lot of times in a lot of organizations, people who are doing business analysis work actually have the title of product manager, even though the products that they're launching are internal. Okay. So Joy has a vision statement pulled up. Here's an example. I'm not going to go through it in detail. If we put the entire vision statement here for the project, your eyes would kind of gloss over. But this at least gives you a flavor of the types of things that we include in one. So, for example, just to summarize, the vision statement for our chemical tracking system is that it's for scientists who need to request containers of chemicals. The chemical tracking system is an information system that will do X, Y, Z. Okay. All right. So the vision statement applies to the product as a whole, and it's important to remember this because there are a lot of different components to an entire product. A product might be split up into multiple releases over multiple projects or even multiple programs. And the overall vision should change relatively slowly as a product's strategic positioning or a company's business objectives evolve over time. However, the concept of scope pertains to a specific project or iteration that will implement the next increment of the product's functionality or vision. So, think about vision as applying to the entire product. Think about scope as applying to a particular project or subcomponent of a project. So, scope should be more dynamic than vision because, the stakeholders adjust the contents of each release within its schedule, budget, resource, and quality constraints. You don't know all of these at the beginning of the entire program or when you're, conceiving of the product itself. You adjust these over time as you gain more information with each iteration in each project. So, the scope for the current release should be clear, but the scope of future releases will be fuzzier the further out you look. And this outlook, by the way, is applicable whether you're doing waterfall or agile or some other incremental or an iterative approach to development. But what you can do in any of these approaches is to build a roadmap for subsequent releases and plan on your projects that your scope statements are going to change over time. And specifically, the distant releases will be fuzzy. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about, 4 models that we can help use to control scope. We aligned a little bit on, business requirements and some of the, different aspects of business requirements. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the models. So even with a, really solid product vision, your product's going to fail if you don't manage scope, right? You're either going to go over budget, you're going to run out of time or resources, or, even more importantly, it's not going to meet the business objectives that you originally defined. So we're going to talk about all 4 of the models that you see here on the screen, the context diagram, the ecosystem map, the feature tree, and the event list for all as means for managing scope. And if you've defined clear business requirements, everything within these 4 models should relate back to those business requirements. And the collection of the business requirements in these 4 scope models helps you define a clear scope boundary for a project. And these are, 4 models that we create all the time on our projects, usually the first ones that we try to do, so that we can have a good understanding of what the scope of the project is. All right, so the first scope model is the context diagram. It defines the scope boundary on the system and its connections to all the external entities that interface to the system in some way. There's a very simple, prototype on the screen here, and we'll get to a specific example in a moment. The system is typically shown in a circle in the center of this diagram. It encompasses software, hardware, and human components. The boxes contain external entities that interface with the system. They could be things like groups of users, other systems, or hardware. And the lines show data or physical objects and the direction of flow between the system and external entities. Some people think of this as a top level in a data flow diagram because you can show data or information flowing to and from the system and through the interfaces. This model only shows entities that interact directly with the system, which is important in contrast to another model, which we'll see in just a moment. So here's an example from our chemical tracking system. And I jumped ahead. So as you can see, here's an example from our chemical tracking system. And, in this case, the buyer is an external entity. We show all the different external entities that are interacting with this, this chemical tracking system in the diagram. So the buyer is an external entity. And let's assume it's a person for now. It can be a person, it can be a system. As you can see, we've got other external systems that are external entities that are systems, that are databases, that are organizations, and that's okay. So let's assume that the buyer is an external, the buyer is a person for now. She takes the vendor chemical request from the system and does something with it. And she or her system also passes a vendor order status back to the system. And now I'm, since I've gone through this in a little bit of detail, and you can see more detail on the screen, I'm going to pass it back to Joy to talk about some of the other models.
So our second model is the ecosystem map. It's actually similar to system context diagram, but in a minute I'm going to highlight some of the differences for you. First, let's talk about what it is. So this is a model that shows all of the systems that are related to the system being developed. Right, so we can identify all the different interfaces that we're going to have requirements for. The boxes in this diagram are systems, and the arrows show how major pieces of data, major data objects flow between systems and the direction of that data flowing. So those arrows could be bidirectional, or you could have arrows pointing both directions. Now, there's two key differences between this diagram and a context diagram. First, this one's only going to show systems, not groups of users, like the context diagram showed. And the second big difference is this model shows systems that are not directly interfacing to your system, in addition, of course, to the ones that are directly interfacing. So these are looking at systems that are indirectly influencing your system in some way. And this helps us understand what are all the different interfaces that we have to develop, but it also helps us understand the downstream and upstream impacts that our system might have. So let's look at an example. If the data is passed from your system to another system and then on to yet another system, and you change something in your system, then you need to know who's going to be impacted 2 or 3 systems away, even though you're not directly talking to those systems. So in the sample here, you can see system 4 is passing data to system 3, but not talking directly to system 2, but we still very much care about, if we're working on system 2, we still very much care about system 4 because that's actually feeding data into our system indirectly. Now, to create one of these models, we identify all the affected systems by following that data consumption and where that data is produced. All right, and so the nature of this model is that some of the things that are going to show up on here, both systems and data objects, will also show up in a system context diagram. But in almost all situations, you would have some systems and some data that show up on this that are not in your context diagram. Let me show you an example from our chemical tracking system. And notice I've got the chemical tracking system right in the middle of it. I like to do that if it's possible. It's not a requirement that you put it in the middle, but in this particular case, it's in the middle, a little bit bolder border on it to highlight that that's the system we're really talking about. So in this particular case, you can see that the chemical tracking system passes requests to the purchasing system, and then that system, the purchasing system, passes orders to a vendor. So I'm going up the purchasing system in this diagram and over to the left, in that top left corner, you see the vendor. Now, even though the chemical tracking system does not talk to the vendor directly, we benefit by showing that the request turns into an order that goes to the vendor, because this will help us to know to include certain data fields in that request when we pass it to the purchasing system, so that the purchasing system can then pass the right information on to the vendor. So really it's all about the data in this diagram. Obviously it's a systems diagram, but to get the right systems, you've got to understand what those pieces of data are, and it's both flowing out of our system or coming into our system. And the point at which the data doesn't get used by another system, that's when you can stop showing the boundaries of this particular diagram. All right, our third scope model is the feature tree. This depicts the product's features organized into logical groups, and we hierarchically are going to subdivide the features into further detail. We start by actually putting our product in the oval. That's the project you're working on or that product that you're building. We have top-level features. We call those L1 features. They're shown in boxes. And then the sub-features to L1 are called L2 features, and they are branched off of the L1 feature line. And then we'll have L3 features that are off of the L2 feature line. Right, so you can keep going. If you want L4 features, they would come off of the L3 lines. Honestly, we don't usually go to that much depth, but there certainly could be a need to do it. What I love about this diagram, and I will tell you, I think this is probably one of my very favorite models. I think most of us here like to create them, like to use them on projects, but part of the reason for that is you can concisely fit literally all the features for one project in one page. You know, we can get up to 3 levels of features. You can tightly pack them in here, but you get a visual representation in one page of all the different capabilities of a system. A great model that you can show to executives. They love it because it gives them a quick overview of what they're going to expect out of the project that's going on. The other thing is you can get creative with how you use this particular diagram, where you can actually show features that are in scope or out of scope depending on maybe the release. So in this particular case right now I have green features. Well, maybe I would use orange to represent release 2 and blue to represent 3 and so on. So it can actually visually show what capabilities are going to get delivered in any particular release, and I will show you that in my example. Oh, James, you want to say something?
Yeah, another thing that you can use the feature tree for is not just around, you know, system features or system capabilities, but also, you know, areas of the business that might need to change or new business processes that you need to define. So, you know, I've used it on projects to show that, to give our stakeholders a really clear picture of, you know, what are all the different things on the project that are going to change or going to have impacts on different parts of the organization as well as IT systems. And so, you know, it really provides that picture of, you know, from holistically speaking, you know, what requirements you need to define, not just for your systems, but also for your organization and for, you know, the different business units within the organization.
Yeah, great point. And I will flash up here a real quick example of our chemical tracking system. This gives you a much better idea than my template showed you a minute ago of what a feature tree might look like. And again, this one's using some colors to show different release plannings. But again, just a reminder of the syntax here. Order chemicals is an L1 feature with search and chemical request as L2 features off of that. And you can see those are the branch lines coming off of that L1 feature line. And then there's lots of different L3 features off of that. So again, really, really useful tool, and you can get creative about how you might use it. I often get this question, so I'll answer it proactively here, which is, this is a fishbone diagram template, if you're familiar with that. Completely different purpose than the fishbone diagram was designed for, but the template actually works really, really nicely to create this particular layout of the features. And here's our fourth scope model, the event list. This identifies the external events that could trigger behavior in the system. It might reflect actions or business events that are taken by external entities that you would find in a context diagram. It could be actors in a use case. What events are they doing? It could be systems in an ecosystem map that trigger behavior in our system. It might reflect time-triggered events, is another example. And we would use this model to manage scope by allocating certain events to specific releases. So let's look at our chemical tracking system event list. This is actually just a part of it, certainly. This is just a few different things. And so example events would be things like a chemist is placing a request, right? So that's an actor in a use case. Or a vendor is indicating a back order. Or a timing event might be something like it's time to generate an OSHA compliance report. Notice how we've used the brackets here to indicate what's in scope for this release or others. You could also do this in real life using a table and just add a column to it and indicate releases in a column next to it. You don't have to use the fancy brackets. Just visually appealing here. All right, now that we've seen our 4 scope models, again, you know, they were the context diagram, the ecosystem map, the feature tree, and the event list. Let's talk about how we can actually use these to control our scope. All right. So let's say you're creating these requirements and scope models, and then you document them. You put them in a tool or in a business requirements document or something like a vision and scope document. That's a great start. But here's the key, and you've probably all seen this before. You can't assume people have actually read it. Just because you've elicited it, put it on paper, doesn't mean anybody's read it. And more importantly, even if they have read it, you cannot assume that they're going to remember what was in it. Projects go on for a long time, and we tend to forget these kinds of details, really important details, mind you. So knowing this, you have to, and you as the BA, have got to proactively communicate that scope to your team. So, for example, when you're doing elicitation sessions, you could actually remind people of the scope at the beginning of every meeting. You could very quickly show some of these models or show them the business objectives like, hey, before we start this long session to elicit requirements, let's all remember here's what our business objectives are, or here's what our ecosystem map contains. Or if your team is co-located, you could maybe just hang pictures of the models up on the walls where the team is located. I actually worked on a project that did something similar to this, where they took their business objectives and they lined the hall with the different business objectives for the particular project. And this is a hall that literally everybody walked down every day to come into the office, to leave the office, to go to their meeting room for their stand-ups, right? So it was something that was just constantly in front of them. It was hard to not remember what they were. So again, a couple tips there that may help you kind of proactively be communicating these. And one of the things I think is important to understand is that literally everybody on your team should understand these. So yes, the business has to, they have to help define them, but your IT teams, your testing team, they need to understand, why are we doing this project? That will help keep them on scope. I have a funny story from years ago of a developer who was super excited to share with me that he had made the text editor in the application we were working on such that you could change the background color to magenta. And I said to him, I'm like, okay, that's great, but why? And he's like, I just wanted to see if I could do it. And the thing is, I think that exemplifies the typical developer who's excited about being creative and trying new things. So when they go out and accidentally increase scope, they're not trying to do it on purpose. They're not trying to stall your project. They're having fun. They're doing the thing that they do best. So what we want them to do is be very excited about what the actual objectives are, what the real requirements are, and have them stay focused on implementing those without getting too far off scope. So it's just giving them the tools to do that. Now, of course, cutting unnecessary scope at the beginning of a project presumes we can actually define good business requirements. So these business requirements we've been talking about today are really the basis for our controlling scope. So if you have good business requirements, which I'm sure you all will after this webinar, then you can use those to determine which requirements are in or out of scope early in the release cycle. The business objectives are really the most important factor we have to make our scoping decisions. We can actually quantify the value of requirements and cut things that don't add sufficient benefit, or at the very least, we're going to delay them for later releases. And James is going to walk us through that in just a minute, but just as a high-level example, if you can show that you have a feature that adds $10,000 of value to a project that has a $1 million objective, there's a reasonably good chance that that is not the feature you should be implementing right now. You should be looking for the $100,000 or the $500,000 features. Build those at least first, and if you have time and budget later, maybe you can do some of these other things. Typically, I will tell you those things never get built because they just weren't that important. So the other thing that's key here is that just because something is within scope, a boundary scope, that doesn't mean it is within your project's budget and time frame. So that tells us we need something a little bit more than just a scoping model to help decide what should actually be in scope or not in scope for a project. So James, why don't you walk us through this model?
Sure. So, we're going to get down to now, how you go about quantifying the value of every feature or proposed feature that's in a release. And so, this is a model that we call an objective chain that ties requirements back to business objectives. And it assigns a benefit to each requirement or set of requirements. And, these are basically links in a hierarchy that tell us how much the requirements contribute to the overall business objective. And based on this, we can select and eliminate requirements based on facts rather than emotions. So, you've probably all been in prioritization exercises where, either the loudest person in the room makes the decision, or, maybe it's upper management that makes the decision, or you vote. And, none of those are really driving towards, the value that the most important features are going to provide. And so, part of the idea behind objective chains are to, really quantify and have an intelligent way of talking about, which feature is actually driving the most value. And so in the objective chain, we evaluate each requirement or set of requirements, you can do this at the feature level, and determine how much it contributes to the objective. And so I suggest when you're building these out that you group requirements together so you're only doing this comparison on about 10 or 20 things at a time. It doesn't really make sense to do this at the individual functional requirement level. First of all, it's just going to take too long. And second of all, you're not really going to be able to do measurements on every single functional requirement. You don't have to be really precise in the measurements either. Just try to find, a rough order of magnitude in order to quantify how much each feature contributes to the business objective. So for example, will a specific requirement or feature contribute roughly $1,000, $100,000, or $1 million towards a business objective? And you can use the same concept throughout the project duration. When someone requests a new feature, be it an executive or a stakeholder, that they thought of over the weekend, you can use some sort of analysis to help determine if it's really going in the right direction. How much is it contributing to the overall business objective? And now I'm going to walk through an example. And so this is, from our chemical tracking system. And imagine some of the few high-level requirements, such as stockroom inventory recording, chemical container images. And the stockroom inventory recording is used so that the system knows what's in the actual stockroom and can be compared to lab requests for chemicals. So the chemical container images are actual pictures of the chemical containers so that the lab assistants can see what the chemical looks like to make sure they're requesting the right thing. And remember, the objective of this project was to cut expenses by $250,000 within the first year. The stockroom recording equipment helps contribute to our business objectives because if the lab assistant knows what's in the stockroom, they can avoid buying chemicals that are already in stock, right? It helps reduce excessive inventory. And not buying chemicals that are already in stock saves on average, let's say, $200 per chemical. And these are facts that you could go out and gather on your project to determine how much a feature contributes, to either, cutting cost or increasing revenue. And, based on that savings average of $200 per chemical, we know that last year we bought about 500 chemicals unnecessarily, and that gets us to about a $100,000 benefit from this particular requirement. So similarly, the images help the users not make accidental purchases because they can see it and recognize the chemical containers. But this only happens about 50 times a year, and so that gets us only to about a $10,000 value. Just looking at these two features alone, one of them contributes to our overall objective much more significantly than the other, and the other does not. So we likely want to cut that second feature or deprioritize it, at least in terms of the other one. And these are just two features, but I want to demonstrate the simple example for you on how we can tell one feature is worthwhile and how it isn't. And again, we're looking at order of magnitude here. It's, we're not looking at, a $100,000 feature versus a $101,000 feature. It's, much more difficult to make decisions at that level. But if you can get to an order of magnitude, that at least helps you figure out where the highest value features are. And this is important because it's really easy when your project's, moving along to arbitrarily add features that seem small. In other words, small for developers to implement. But in aggregate, the small features add up fast. I've been on projects where a stakeholder will ask for something, hey, can we just, make this quick text change or make this quick color change or move this button over here? And, at the time, the features don't really, look like they're going to add up to that much effort, but they really do add a lot of cost and risk to include them. And the reality is, you probably don't really need them all the time. One of the metrics that we'd like to point to is that, it's pretty interesting that, only about 65% of features are really ever, heavily used in software. So this is a lot of, excessive cost that's used to drive, features into the market that really are very rarely used. And so, using objective chains is a great way for you to help avoid, building the things that you don't really need to include. We also do a training exercise in one of our classes that, demonstrates why this goes wrong so often, why the prioritization exercise goes wrong so often. We put business analysts in the role of being developer and give them some requirements and have them design a solution on paper. And inevitably, they get really excited about their solution and have fun with it, which is great. They start adding scope, they start adding things that they want to see in the solution, they start adding more and more. But then they start creating all these embellishments to the solution, and pretty soon they have things in the solution that are out of scope. They don't help achieve the business objective. It's really easy to do, especially if that's your job, to build things and use your creativity and your innovation to help drive a project forward. But this exercise demonstrates to them why it happens on project all the time. Stakeholders, they're not behaving badly, they're not trying to push things in that aren't needed. It just happens so easily without realizing, unless everybody is totally focused on scope. Okay. So quantifying the value of the features or requirements helps us identify how our top-level requirements tie back to business objectives. But we need to make sure that we maintain that traceability throughout the requirements hierarchy. Every requirement needs to be within the scope boundary and tied back to business objectives. Any requirements that cannot tie back to business objectives need to be removed from scope. And if you have something that's outside the scope boundary, you have to decide if you're going to change the boundary, and you have to make sure it ties back to a business objective. Now, all that's well and good if the scope never changes, or the business never changes their mind, or corporate strategy never changes. But the reality is that requirements will probably change as you proceed. Scope change isn't a bad thing if it helps you steer the project towards satisfying evolving customer needs or an evolving marketplace. In fact, Agile is built on the whole concept that change is very normal, but we have to control it, and not strictly control it per se, but with very smart control around how we're controlling it. And the key to smart control is to manage the change in a smart way to ensure it doesn't derail your project. And this means things like not letting unnecessary changes happen. It means making smart choices about prioritization, by looking at the contribution of each feature or requirement to the business objective. It means being able to cut things to add new things sometimes. And it means that we're making educated decisions instead of accidental or even emotional decisions. So here's a decision process that you might go through when you're faced with changes. Whenever someone requests a new requirement, the analyst needs to ask, is this in scope? One response might be that the proposed requirement is clearly out of scope. Maybe it's important enough that we redefine the scope boundary if it's something that's very important to add. Or perhaps it's interesting, but it should be addressed in a future release or by another project. Another possibility is that the request obviously lies within the defined project scope. So you can incorporate new in-scope requirements in the current project if they're of high priority value to the other requirements that are already committed. But including new requirements often involves making decisions to defer or cancel other planned requirements, unless you're willing to extend the project's duration, right? Something's got to give. So keep in mind, two of these choices can be expensive. So be careful about, whether when choosing either to redefine the scope boundary or to increase the budget. The red ones here are the expensive ones, if that wasn't obvious. So, in summary, newly proposed requirements may fall in scope and, push less important value requirements out of scope, and newly proposed requirements may fall out of scope but be value enough to run in scope. And, I'll say I've gone through this example, with the objective chain and making the decision, but I'll say as business analysts, this is really hard. In fact, this is one of the hardest things that we do as business analysts. And you may not think as a product manager or a business analyst that this is, part of your job, or you may think that you're going to get pushback. But this is absolutely something that business analysts should be doing. They should be involved in the conversations around scope and, helping to drive the business to make the right decisions as to, what features are, supposed to be there. Your job isn't just to sit there and document requirements that anybody asks for. You should be making smart decisions about scope. All right, so that takes us through most of our content. We talked about the business requirements and covered the scope models, and now I'm going to pass it back to Simon for Q&A and to wrap up.
Here's a few resources that might be helpful to you. Most of the content is aligned with Chapter 5 of the Software Requirements book that you see at the top right there. And the models are covered in much more depth in the Visual Models book on the left-hand side. And we do have some time left for question and answers, so let me open up the Q&A box. And I see a question from Darren. The user requirement example seems very high level. How do you get to the detail when they order chemicals? Who can order chemicals? Limitations of chemicals that can be ordered, et cetera?
I'll start, James. Sorry. So, Darren, great question. I think, what you're describing there, the answer to those, a lot of those are really going to get actually into what I would call the functional or the solution requirements. Potentially, that is a high-level user requirement, and you would break it into lower-level ones. If you're in Agile, that could be an Epic, and maybe you have user stories that maps to. But generally speaking, just want to share a tip here that when I'm talking about trying to figure out those kinds of questions, and even what questions I should be asking, like you've listed, I'm thinking about how I model that user story in a bit more depth. I'm looking at the data model, right? So I've got this thing called a chemical. I would think about modeling that chemical in relation to other data that would help me then go down a path of doing some things like thinking about, well, how is each piece of data created? How is it used? How is it removed from the system? So there's just different actions that can happen to the data. So it's a combination of going through that iterative elicitation analysis process to define these details. And whether in your organization you call those user requirements or you call them functional requirements, I don't think is actually all that important, just that you're actually going to that level of detail and you're spot on. You have to understand things like how do we get, who can order the chemicals or the limitations of those chemicals. So great question. Anything you want to add, James?
Yeah, I mean, just, it may seem like a lot of the models are high level, and they're supposed to be. There's a time and place for, working out the details, and there's an audience for working out the details. But there's also an importance to being able to communicate things at the higher level. And so, different decisions need to be made with different levels of information. And so that's one of the reasons why we start off with the high level models and then move down to the lower level details that you refer to in your question, Darren.
A question from Chris. How do you determine if a requirement is unnecessary?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, the easiest way is to determine whether it traces back to a business objective. So, you usually won't trace an individual functional requirement back to a business objective. It's almost too much level of detail to really determine whether it contributes to the business objective. But you might, have a feature that functional requirement traces back to, and you should be able to determine whether that feature contributes to the business objective, and if so, how much does it contribute? And so, that exercise should be done at, more or less the feature level by figuring out, okay, does this feature contribute to the business objective? And the second follow-up question always needs to be, how does it contribute to the business objective? What's the importance of this feature such that it, meets the business objective? The other way to ask the question is, could we meet our business objectives if we didn't have this requirement, if we didn't have this feature? If the answer is yes, then it's probably something that's not necessary.
Yep, that's great.
Question from James Beck. Do you see people using objective change in an agile environment?
Great question, James. I'm actually going to jump down to Simon. I see another agile-related one I want to ask at the same time. I think this is agile-related, the way it's phrased. So Francis asks, the scope, definition, and control processes are similar to the backlog grooming and story time defined by the agile methodology. So how does the BA process interface with projects, or is there an overlap that can create conflicting information? For example, the BA gathers data from his stakeholders, but a different set of requirements, priorities are communicated by the product owner. So these are kind of agile questions, and I think both we can address maybe at the same time here. So first of all, objective chains and agile environment, absolutely. Everything we talked today about can fit in the agile environment. And the way that works, if you think about it in agile, there's a backlog of things, whether they're user stories, features, whatever, that need to get developed, and that backlog is meant to be prioritized. So the most important things are at the top of the backlog and get implemented in the first iterations, right? Well, how do we prioritize the things in the backlog if we don't use techniques like that? That's the question I would ask back, right? The key is you've got to use something to do that prioritization. And what we're saying is do things like understand the value of the things in the backlog. You don't have to spend a lot of time doing this. Make some assumptions so you can get some quick and dirty numbers out there. If that's okay, document those assumptions so if they prove to be wrong later, we can adjust. But the point is, you've got to do something. If you're not doing that, you're using intuition and emotion, and that is a very, very dangerous world to live in. So what we're trying to do is arm you with a tool to actually go quantify the value and prioritize according to that. And then just very quickly to address kind of the second part of this is, I feel like this is probably a pretty big topic, but I feel like the business analyst role is very important in an agile project. Now, that means either the product owner needs to have BA skills, or there needs to be an actual BA person working on the project with that product owner side by side with them. The important point, though, is that business analysis skills like these have to get done in Agile by somebody. So there shouldn't be someone doing this on one side and somebody else doing product ownership on the other side, they need to be in lockstep together. I think those need to be very, very integrated roles. So is there anything you want to add, James? Or?
No, just that, I actually used objective chains, before I worked at Seilevel without really knowing I was doing it. And so, I worked for a fairly small startup, and we had, literally less than 10 customers. And, it was pretty easy to prioritize based on, which customer was the most strategic for us, which ones did we need to make happy so that they would buy more. And so, it was pretty easy to go through each feature and determine, okay, which of these features are going to contribute to the most revenue by which customers are more likely to buy, how much more are really likely to sell by implementing this particular feature. So, that's another exercise you can do that's, in an agile environment, if you, can kind of, if you have a good understanding of what your customer needs are.
Okay.
Another webinar attendee asks, do you have a recommended tool to track traceability, or do you keep this documented and updated manually?
Yes and yes. I don't personally want to sit here and recommend a particular tool or not. We try to stay pretty agnostic to the tools because we find our customers use different tools, so we get exposure to lots of different tools. I will tell you, I think there's some fantastic tools out there that actually can help you do this tracing, and if you can get your hands on a tool, that is hands down the best way to do this kind of tracing and linking and keeping this data. As a separate side note, you can find either reach out to us via email or you can go grab it off our website. We have done a tool study that compares different features of requirements tools. It's a few years old now, it's from 2011, and we look to hopefully update that soon, but that's going to tell you a little bit more about what we think about tools in depth. That said, you can do this manually. We use a requirements mapping matrix in Excel in the absence of having a tool in a particular situation. That's another one of our models. We didn't talk about it here today, but it's a bit like a traceability matrix. I think of it as a little bit more flexible than a typical traceability matrix, but in there you can do a lot of this linking, particularly between the different types of requirements. We would link all of our features back to business objectives, or requirements back to business objectives right in there, and even link them to other models in that particular case.
We have a couple more questions. This one from Robin. Where does a feature fit in your 3-level model?
Okay, great question, Robin, and I presume that you're talking about the hierarchy of business requirement to user requirement to functional requirements. If you're not, then ask another question, because I'm going to assume that's, since there's not a dialogue here, I'm pretty sure that's what you're talking about. That's a good point. So features to me are groups of requirements, like a set of requirements, and I think of it, a feature is like almost like a colloquial way of talking about a group of requirements. And so you find these logical groupings that describe capabilities that are similar, and you call that a feature. A feature is usually, you saw in our example, 2 or 3 words. They're typically written as nouns, don't have to be. So I don't necessarily think of it actually in the hierarchy per se, but the best way if you want to put it in the hierarchy is either think of it as a group of things at the functional level, or if you're not doing that user requirement level, you could actually call those features. There's usually a similar mapping between the user requirement and a feature, but definitely not going to say that's a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, and I mean different organizations, have different levels of detail in each of the hierarchies. So, you may only create a feature tree, for your functional requirements, but on the project I was on, it actually made sense to bring some of the user requirements up into the feature tree because, it was important for us to consider some of the business process changes that we needed to gather requirements around. So, I would say you could build the features at any level of the hierarchy. There can be any logical grouping of any of the 3 levels.
A couple more questions. How do you handle scope creep? How to tackle with valued clients?
Probably talking about how you have a valued client and you don't want to tell them no. But what I will say is that ultimately you have to do it, and if there's actually a scope creep going on there, the cool thing about these models is it gives you logic. It gives you something to reason with them. Most people, when they are shown real data about why something is actually important or not, is really, they're reasonable. They take the data in and they make the right decision. And so what you're doing is arming them with data that they've never had before. They've used emotions or they've used their intuition, which is not necessarily wrong, but usually isn't precise. And so this gives you a little bit better tool to have that conversation with them. And keep in mind, if they're trying to do scope creep, the scope that they're talking about may actually be more important than something they're already building. So then you're having the conversation about, hey, look, that thing you're talking about, wow, that's like a $100,000 feature. Let's go cut this $50,000 feature, or these three, $50,000 features, so that we can have your $100,000 feature. So don't just say no. Really do the analysis to figure out what the right answer to it is.
We have time for one last question before we wrap up. This one from Martha. Are the models you discussed today on your website that we can view and use?
Yep, they are. Thanks, Martha, for a good question. So on our website, you will find an example of, there's 22 different models that are all in the Visual Models for Software Requirements book. But on our website, we've put the model and a little bit of description of it, example of it. The other thing you'll find on our website is a download of it's a zip file that gives you templates for all the different requirements models that are in that book. And it's templates that are going to be Microsoft Office products. So they're not for a specific tool, but it's things like Visio templates, Excel templates, and so on. So you're welcome to take those, use them however you want, change them if you need to for your organization. If you have any trouble finding that, reach out to any one of us and we'll happily just send it over to you as well.
Well, we're sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but both Joy and James would be happy to answer any of your questions via email as well. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your time and hope you found value in today's presentation. Please feel free to check out the Seilevel website, as Joy mentioned, for free resources, our blog, and other information. Thank you all very much.